On the morning of November 16, 2012, a baker in Kansas woke up for a shift that did not exist anymore. She had been on a picket line outside her own plant for a week. That part she knew. What she did not know, what nobody on that line knew, was that a lawyer in New York had already drafted the paperwork that would end the entire company. All 33 bakeries, all 5,500 delivery routes, all 565 distribution centers, and every one of the 18,500 people who worked in them. Not one plant, not one region, the whole thing, in a single filing. The company was Hostess Brands. If you have ever opened a lunchbox in America, you have eaten something they made. Twinkies, Ding Dongs, Ho-Hos, Snowballs, Wonder Bread. These were not niche products. These were the products that other products were compared to. And here is the part that I keep coming back to. 11 years after that morning, those same brands sold for $5.6 billion. Companies fail. That is not the story here. What makes this one strange is the speed and the shape of it. A company with 33 factories and brands that everyone in the country recognizes does not usually vanish. It gets carved up. A competitor takes the plants. A private equity firm takes the brands. The workers get transferred with the assets and their new badge says a different name on Monday. Messy but continuous. That is not what happened. Hostess did not restructure. It did not get acquired. It liquidated, the legal term for selling a company for parts and ceasing to exist, and it did that 6 days after its bakers walked out. 6 days. The company's explanation was simple, and they said it in the press release itself. Their CEO, Gregory Rayburn, said, "We deeply regret the necessity of today's decision, but we do not have the financial resources to weather an extended nationwide strike." That sentence became the entire public story. The bakers struck, the company died, the Twinkie was collateral damage. That is what most of America was told in November 2012, and if you search for this today, it is still mostly what you will find. I do not think that sentence is a lie. I think it is true in the narrowest possible way, and I think the 8 words that matter most in it are, "We do not have the financial resources." Because they had not had the financial resources for a very long time, and there is a specific date when that stopped being an opinion and became a documented fact. There are 3 things about this story that took me a while to understand, and I am going to walk you through all 3. The first is how a company that owns some of the most recognized food brands in America managed to run out of money twice in 8 years. That answer is not about baking. It is about a purchase made in 1995. The second is what the strike actually was. Not whether it was justified, what it was, mechanically in the sequence of events, because the strike happened after something else, and the order matters enormously. And the third is the one that made me want to make this video at all. The brands survived. Every single one of them is on a shelf right now. What did not survive was the workforce that made them, and the difference between those 2 outcomes is not an accident, it is the design. Let me start with the building. Interstate Bakeries Corporation was founded in Kansas City in 1930. Read that year again. This company was born in the worst month of the worst economic collapse in American history, and it survived it by selling bread and cake to people who could not afford much else. For 65 years, it was a large regional baker. Solid, unglamorous, profitable in a boring way. Then in January 1995, it did the thing that defined the rest of its life. It bought Continental Baking Company from Ralston Purina for $330 million in cash, plus 16.9 million shares of its own stock. Continental Baking owned Wonder Bread, and it owned Hostess. On paper, this was a triumph. Interstate went from a regional baker to the largest wholesale baker in the United States overnight. It now owned bread and it owned snack cake. the two highest volume categories in the aisle. Here is what it also bought, and what nobody put a number on at the time. It bought a delivery system, not a warehouse operation, a direct store delivery network, which is a specific and very expensive way to run a food company. A driver in his own truck goes to individual grocery stores, walks the aisle, pulls the stale product, stocks the fresh product, arranges the display, and drives on. At its peak, this meant 5,500 separate delivery routes crossing the country every day. It also meant this: because bread and cake had come from two different companies with two different union contracts, they were delivered in separate trucks. Two trucks from the same company to the same supermarket on the same morning. That was not a mistake somebody made. That was written into the labor agreements, and by the end, there were 372 separate collective bargaining agreements governing this company. Not 372. I should say something about what the work actually was, because bakery is a misleading word for these buildings. A wholesale bakery of this size does not have ovens you open and close. It has a tunnel, a continuous oven, sometimes over 100 feet long, that never stops and never cools down. Product goes in one end on a moving band and comes out the other end baked, and the rate at which it moves is the rate at which the entire building runs. Everything upstream and downstream is timed to that band. On the bread side, that meant the plant ran at night. Bread has to be on a store shelf in the morning, and it is stale within days, so the mixing started in the dark and the trucks were loading before sunrise. A career on the bread side of one of these companies meant a working life inverted from everybody else's, sleeping in the afternoon, leaving the house when your kids were coming home. On the cake side, the process was stranger and more mechanical. A Twinkie is baked as a solid cake. The cream is not folded in. It is injected afterward, from underneath, through holes in the bottom of the cake, by a machine that does it several times a second. If you have ever turned one over and seen 3 small marks on the base, that is what those are. None of this is romantic work. It is hot, it is loud, it runs on a clock you do not control, and the motions repeat. But it was skilled in a specific way. A continuous oven is an unforgiving thing, and the people who could keep a line running at speed without a jam or a scrap batch were the reason the plant made money that shift. That is who we are talking about for the rest of this video, not a symbol. People who knew how to run a hotline. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where this story usually gets told badly. The standard version says, the unions made it impossible to run efficiently, therefore the unions killed it. That version skips a question. Who signed those agreements? Management did, over decades. In exchange for wage restraint and labor peace, executives traded away operational flexibility. And every one of those trades made a quarterly number look better while making the company harder to run 5 years later. By the time anybody wanted to undo them, the people who had made those deals were long gone, and the people still there were the ones holding the pension promise. By 2004, the math had stopped working. Bread consumption in America was falling. Low-carbohydrate diets were at their peak, which sounds trivial until you remember that this company's largest single product was white sandwich bread. Fuel costs were rising, and this was a business that ran 5,500 trucks, and the plants were old. On September 22, 2004, Interstate Bakeries filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection with roughly $450 million in debt. The stock went from $34 a share to $2.05. Chapter 11 is supposed to be a repair shop. You go in broken, a court protects you from your creditors, you shed what you cannot afford, and you come out lighter. Interstate Bakeries stayed in that repair shop for 4.5 years. That is one of the longest Chapter 11 cases in the history of American food manufacturing. It came out on February 3, 2009. Ripplewood Holdings, a private equity firm, took a 50% stake. The company renamed itself Hostess Brands that November, dropping the corporate name for the brand name, which tells you which of the two the new owners thought was actually worth something. Now look at what came out of that repair shop. Going in, about 32,000 employees, 54 bakeries, $450 million in debt. Coming out, about 22,000 employees, 9 bakeries closed, and $670 million in debt. Read that again. It went into bankruptcy owing $450 million, spent 4.5 years being fixed, cut 10,000 jobs, and emerged owing $220 million more than when it started. That is the sentence I would put on the wall of this entire story. The workforce absorbed the losses. The balance sheet did not improve. 10,000 people paid for a restructuring that left the company more leveraged than the day it filed. And this is where I have to be fair to the other side, because there is a real argument here. Ripplewood and the lenders would tell you the company was worthless without new money, that new money is debt, and that without it there would have been no Hostess at all in 2009, no jobs, no brands, nothing. That argument is not stupid. It is how leveraged rescues work. But it comes with a condition, and the condition is that the rescue has to buy time that gets used. Hostess got 4.5 years of court protection and 10,000 people's livelihoods. What it did with them is the next part. August 2011. Hostess stopped making its required pension contributions, $4 million a month, owed under its union contracts, into the multi-employer pension plans that its bakers had been paying into for their entire working lives. It just stopped, in violation of the contracts it had signed. I want you to sit with the position that puts a 58-year-old baker in. She has worked 31 years. Every one of those years, a portion of her compensation, money she earned and did not take home, went into a fund. That fund is her plan for not working when she is 70, and the company that is holding that money for her simply stopped sending it, and kept operating, and kept her on the line. By the time this ended, the unfunded pension obligation was around $110 million. Now, in the same window, something else was happening in the executive offices. As the company prepared for its second bankruptcy, the board converted senior management's performance bonuses into guaranteed salary. For the chief executive, Brian Driscoll, that took reported compensation from $750,000 to $2.55 million. I need to say clearly what that is and what it is not. It is not theft, and it was not hidden. It went through a board, and it is in the record. The stated logic was retention. You cannot fix a company that is about to file for bankruptcy if your executives leave, and a bonus that depends on performance is worth nothing to an executive at a company that is about to fail, so you convert it into salary. That is the argument. I understand the argument. It is also the case that the exact same reasoning, applied to a baker, produces the opposite conclusion. Her deferred compensation was in a pension fund. The company's response to a cash crisis was to stop funding it. His deferred compensation was in a bonus. The company's response to the same cash crisis was to guarantee it. Driscoll resigned in March 2012. Gregory Rayburn replaced him at $125,000 a month. By this point, Hostess had gone through 6 chief executives in 8 years. On January 10, 2012, Hostess Brands filed for Chapter 11 for the second time. Debt, more than $860 million. Employees, about 19,000. 3 years out of the last bankruptcy. $200 million deeper in debt than when it emerged. And now the company came to its workers with a proposal. Here is what was in it. An 8% wage cut in the first year, building to a 27% reduction over 5 years. For a baker earning $16.12 an hour, that meant a path to $11.26. termination of the pension plan, the one the company had already stopped paying into 17 months earlier, and health insurance premiums doubled with reduced coverage. In September 2012, the Bakers Union, the Bakery, Confectionery, Tobacco Workers, and Grain Millers International Union, put that offer to its members. 92% voted against it. Not a narrow margin, not a divided membership. 92%. That number is the one that gets left out of the short version of this story, and it is the number that tells you what those workers thought their situation actually was. When 92% of a workforce rejects a deal that keeps them employed, they are not being reckless. They are telling you they have run the numbers on the alternative and concluded the deal is not meaningfully better. They had watched a 4.5-year bankruptcy take 10,000 jobs and leave the debt higher. They had watched the pension payments stop and the company keep running. They had watched a CEO's guaranteed pay more than triple, and they were being asked to fund the next attempt with a 27% cut and no pension. In October, the bankruptcy court authorized the company to impose the terms anyway. On November 9th, workers struck at 24 production facilities, roughly 15,000 union members. On November 12th, 3 plants closed permanently. On November 14th, the company issued an ultimatum: return to work by 5 p.m. Thursday, or we liquidate. On November 16th, Hostess Brands announced it was winding down the entire company. On November 21st, a judge approved it. So, did the strike kill Hostess? Here is the honest answer, and it has 2 halves. The first half, yes, mechanically. A baking company cannot bake without bakers. When 15,000 people stop working at 24 plants, production stops, and a company in Chapter 11 with no cash reserve cannot survive stopped production. The company's statement was accurate as a description of the final week. The second half is the one that changes the story. A company that stopped funding its pension obligations in August 2011 was not solvent in November 2012. It was operating on borrowed time and borrowed money, and it had been doing so for 15 months before a single worker walked off a line. There is a useful way to think about this. If your company can survive an 8-day strike, an 8-day strike does not kill it. If it cannot survive an 8-day strike, the strike is not what is wrong with your company. It is the thing that reveals what was already wrong. And there is one more piece, and I want to flag clearly that this is an argument critics made rather than something a court ruled on. In a Chapter 11 case, secured creditors get paid first from whatever the assets sell for. Hostess's brands were extremely valuable, and its operations were losing money. Which means that for the people at the front of the repayment line, a liquidation, selling the brands clean, with no pension liability, no 372 labor agreements, no 5,500 delivery routes attached, was not obviously the worst outcome available. Hostess denied that framing. There was no finding of wrongdoing. I am not telling you that anyone engineered this. I am telling you that when a company's most valuable assets are worth more separated from its workforce than attached to it, the workforce is in a position that no amount of negotiating skill can fix. And that position was created in 1995 and 2004 and 2009 by people who had left the building long before the bakers ever voted. There is one more detail from the liquidation, and I include it because it is small and it is precise, and it explains why this story still makes people angry 14 years later. While the company was winding down, while the 18,500 were being processed out, Hostess went to the bankruptcy court and requested retention bonuses for senior managers. 19 of them, $1.8 million total, ranging from $7,400 to $130,500. The stated justification was that liquidation is itself a complex job. Somebody has to run 33 plant closures, manage the asset sales, handle the legal process, and get the maximum value for creditors. If those people leave, the estate is worth less to everyone, including the workers waiting on their final claims. That is a coherent argument. It is also, again, the same argument in a different direction. The people needed to shut the company down were paid to stay, and the people needed to run it were told the company could not afford them. Now watch what happened to the assets. On February 28, 2013, Flowers Foods bought the bread brands, Wonder Bread and the rest, for around $360 million. On March 12, 2013, Apollo Global Management and C. Dean Metropolis and Company bought the cake business for $410 million. Twinkies, Ding Dongs, Ho-Hos, Snowballs. They also took 4 bakeries, Columbus, Georgia, Emporia, Kansas, Indianapolis, and Schiller Park, Illinois. Schiller Park closed in October 2014. Twinkies were back on shelves by July 2013. 8 months. Here's the number that matters. The relaunched Hostess ran on roughly 1,170 workers, 18,500 to 1,170. That is not a smaller version of the same company. That is a different kind of company wearing the same brand, and the way it got there is worth understanding because it is not mysterious and it is not even hidden. The new owners did not inherit the labor agreements. Liquidation extinguished them. They did not rebuild the 5,500 delivery routes. They reformulated products for longer shelf life and shipped through warehouses and third-party logistics, the way a packaged snack moves rather than the way fresh bread moves. And they concentrated production into a small number of heavily automated plants instead of a national network of aging ones. Every one of those changes is a genuine improvement in efficiency. I am not going to pretend otherwise. The old system, 2 trucks to the same store, 372 agreements, 54 bakeries, was not sustainable, and the people who say it had to change are right. What I want you to notice is the sequence. Every one of those changes was available to Hostess in 2004 and in 2009. What made them possible in 2013 was not a new idea. It was the fact that 18,500 people were no longer part of the company. The efficiency did not arrive instead of the layoffs. The layoffs were the mechanism. In 2016, Hostess went public through Gore's Holdings at a valuation of $2.3 billion. It took the ticker symbol TWNK. On September 11, 2023, the J.M. Smucker Company agreed to buy Hostess Brands for $5.6 billion. The deal closed on November 7, 2023. $410 million in 2013, $5.6 billion in 2023. I have seen people use those two numbers to argue that the bankruptcy was good, that a dying company was saved and made valuable again. And in the narrowest financial sense, that is what the numbers show. But value did not appear out of nowhere. The Twinkie in 2023 is the same product it was in 2012. The recipe did not get better. The brand was not more famous. The demand was not larger. What changed is that in 2012, the brand came attached to 18,500 jobs, $110 million of pension obligation, 372 labor agreements, and 33 aging plants. In 2013, it came attached to none of those things. The $5.6 billion is not a measure of how good the Twinkie is. A large part of it is a measure of what was taken off. I keep thinking about how this company started. Interstate Bakeries was founded in Kansas City in 1930, in the middle of the Great Depression, and the Twinkie was invented in that same period and sold 2 for a nickel, because a nickel was what a person had. That was the entire commercial idea. A cheap, sweet thing for people who could not afford an expensive one. For most of the century that followed, the company delivered on that in both directions. Cheap product on one side of the counter, a wage, a route, a pension on the other. Neither half was glamorous. Both halves were real. 92 years later, the product is still on the shelf and still cheap. The other half is gone. The bakers who struck in November 2012 have been called a lot of things since. Reckless, self-destructive, the people who killed the Twinkie. I do not think that is what they were. I think they were people who had already given 10,000 of their coworkers jobs to one bankruptcy, who had watched their pension payments stop while the company kept running, and who were being asked to hand over a quarter of their wages to fund a third attempt by the same management that had lost the first two. They looked at that and 92% of them said no. Whatever else you want to say about that decision, it was not made by people who did not understand their situation. It was made by people who understood it exactly. The company had one asset that could not be cut, sold, restructured, or automated away. It was the only one that was not for sale in 2013.